In the quiet town where I grew up, there was always a story about the Ridgewick house. It sat on the edge of town, a crumbling relic with peeling paint and shattered windows, swallowed by weeds and shadowed by brambles that clawed at the walls. People said it was haunted lights flickering in the dead of night. Strange sounds that drifted on the wind, but no one really went near it anymore. It was the kind of place you passed with a quick glance and hurried steps as if crossing a boundary you shouldn't. My name is Mark Harris, and I was 29 when everything changed. I'd grown up in a neighborhood where life was simple and predictable. Weekend barbecues, Sunday church kids playing until the streetlights flickered on. I worked as a teacher at the local high school, lived with my wife and our daughter in a modest home just a few miles from that old house. We valued routine safety, the kind of trust that comes from knowing your neighbors and locking your doors without worry. But even in the most settled lives, cracks can appear. I remember the first odd thing was a call from my daughter's school, a teacher mentioning she'd wandered off during recess. That wasn't like her. Then small things started to pile up, her saying she heard whispers outside at night, or that she saw someone staring at her from the edge of our yard. I chalked it up to childhood imagination, the way kids can fill silence with shadows. Still, that unease settled in my chest like a cold stone. The Ridgewick house always felt like a presence, watching a silent sentinel of forgotten things. And then came the day my daughter didn't come home when she was supposed to. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with bruised shades of orange and purple, and I stood on the porch calling her name into the thickening dusk. The street was empty except for the rustling leaves and the distant bark of a dog. That night, as the air grew colder and the shadows lengthened, I felt something shift, not just in the world around me, but inside. The calm that had cradled my life was cracking, and I knew we were about to cross into something darker. Something no parent ever wants to face. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe and join me in uncovering the stories buried beneath silence, the ones that refuse to be forgotten. Those early days before everything fell apart were filled with quiet normalcy. I taught history classes during the day, drove my daughter to soccer practice in the evenings, and spent weekends with my wife Laura, gardening or fixing up the house. We lived a modest life in a town where everyone knew your name and your business. The Ridgewick house was a story told in hushed tones, a dare passed among kids but mostly forgotten by adults. I trusted that world. I believed in order, in safety, in the idea that darkness stayed at the edges and never touched our front porch. So when my daughter Emma mentioned hearing footsteps outside our window or seeing a shadow flicker in the night, I listened but tried not to worry. After all, kids have wild imaginations. But even as I reassured her, I noticed the lingering coldness in her eyes, the way she would pause mid-sentence as if listening for something no one else could hear. The neighborhood itself seemed to hold its breath. The streets that once hummed with the chatter of children playing became quieter as the sun set earlier and earlier. On the rare evenings I walked home late, I'd pass the Ridgewick house and feel the weight of its silence pressing in. No wind stirred its broken shutters, no light slipped through its cracked panes, just stillness as if the house itself was waiting. Then one evening my wife called me from the kitchen with a concerned look. "Mark, have you seen Emma? She was supposed to be home an hour ago." Her voice was calm but edged with worry. I checked the clock. She was right. I stepped outside into the cooling air, the scent of damp earth and fading summer blooms heavy around me. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. I called her name again, louder this time, my voice echoing into the empty night. No answer. My heart quickened, the calm slipping away like sand through fingers. Something was wrong, and that's when I noticed it. The faint sound of footsteps on the cracked pavement behind the Ridgewick house, slow and deliberate, just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow. I turned toward the noise, but the darkness swallowed whatever was there. My breath caught. That moment, the silence, the shadow, the sudden chill that was the first crack in the world I thought I knew. And it was only just beginning. The moment Ava burst into her parents' kitchen that night, the air shifted in a way I'll never forget. She was trembling, barely able to catch her breath, and the words tumbled out in a rush. Sam was gone, taken from the Ridgewick house by a man nobody knew. Her panic was raw and immediate, filling the room with a sharp edge of fear that I hadn't felt before. Her parents moved quickly, calling the police, their voices tense but controlled, trying to contain the chaos while offering what little comfort they could. I remember standing there watching, feeling utterly powerless as the reality settled in. Sam wasn't just missing, he'd been taken. When the officers arrived, their faces were serious but measured. Detective Marisol Keene was in charge, a steady presence, who immediately began organizing a search. She was the kind of person who didn't rush to conclusions, but the signs were unmistakable. The overturned stool, the torn fabric, the footprints layered over one another in the basement dust. Everything pointed to a struggle, and no longer was this just a missing child's case. It was a kidnapping. The evidence suggested Sam had been held, maybe even hidden away in that very house somewhere behind the walls where no one had thought to look. The search teams moved methodically through the house, sweeping every room, every shadowed corner. When they found the makeshift corridor behind the basement boards, it was clear someone had been living there. Blankets, a bucket of stale water. The air was thick with neglect and desperation. But Sam was gone. Detective Keene's face tightened as she briefed the families. There were no leads beyond the house itself, no footprints outside, no clues in the overgrown yard. Whoever had taken Sam had vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions and growing dread behind. Days passed without word. The community held its breath, parents tightening their grips on their children, neighbors watching their streets with wary eyes. Then, out of nowhere, a jogger found a man collapsed near a roadside ditch miles from Ridgewick. He was gaunt and bruised, covered in the marks of long-term captivity. Rope burns, deep bruises, scars from old restraints. He was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy. Emergency crews rushed him to the hospital where doctors immediately suspected prolonged abuse. There was no identification, no clues about who he was, only the desperate story his injuries told. Detective Keene was called to the hospital. She arrived late at night, the sterile corridors glowing under harsh fluorescent lights. The man was unresponsive at first, but when he finally stirred, his eyes told a story of unimaginable endurance. His name was Jacob Hale, a name that sent a ripple through the department. He'd been missing for 10 years, vanished under mysterious circumstances that had turned cold long ago. But here he was, a living thread to a past no one had been able to unravel until now. Jacob's memories came slowly fragmented and painful. He spoke of dark basements, masked captors who never showed their faces, a network of places where he was moved, like cargo old warehouses, run-down buildings near train tracks and factories. The scent of chemicals haunted him, the feeling of chains and cold concrete under his hands. He had never been alone in his suffering, but the captors were careful, always shifting their prisoners, always hiding in plain sight. When he heard about Sam, his expression darkened. If the boy had stumbled into their world, he was in grave danger. Detective Keene and her team pored over property records, uncovering a trail of shell companies buying and selling abandoned buildings. They cross-referenced these with phone data and Jacob's memories, places near rail lines, industrial parks, and creeks where water whispered through cracked concrete. One property stood out, an old mill near a chemical plant recently traded multiple times. The connection was tenuous, but it was the first solid lead they'd had in weeks. Meanwhile, Sam was somewhere in that labyrinth of abandoned places, his wrists raw from bindings, his hope flickering but alive. He overheard his captors talking about moving him again, about deadlines and exposure. The fear tightened around him, but so did his resolve. He clung to the memory of Ava's desperate escape and the promise that someone was looking for him, Every day was a fight to survive a battle against the silence and the shadows. As the police prepared to raid the mill, tension coiled tightly among the team. Detective Keene briefed her officers quietly but firmly this was their chance. The raid would need to be precise and swift, cutting off any escape before the kidnappers could move Sam again. The hours felt like days, the weight of every second pressing on everyone involved. When the team breached the mill, the air was thick with dust and silence broken only by the muffled sounds of footsteps and distant voices. Flashlights sliced through darkness, revealing broken machinery and hidden corners. Then came gunfire, sporadic and wild. Sam was found bound and terrified, used as a human shield by desperate men. The tension shattered as officers overwhelmed the kidnappers, cutting Sam free and finally bringing him back from the brink. But the raid uncovered more than just a captive. Interrogations revealed a sinister truth. Leonard Hale Jacob's own uncle had orchestrated years of imprisonment and cruelty. Driven by greed and bitterness over an inheritance, Leonard had paid to keep Jacob hidden, and when Sam unknowingly crossed into their world, he tried to silence him too. The betrayal cut deep, echoing far beyond the walls of the mill. The arrest of Leonard marked the beginning of a long road to justice. In court, the evidence was damning financial records, witness testimony, and Jacob's harrowing account of 10 years stolen away. The jury heard the full weight of the crimes committed in shadows, and the sentence reflected the severity of the pain inflicted. For Jacob and Sam, the verdict was more than a sentence. It was a reckoning, a moment of truth finally laid bare. Even as Leonard was led away in handcuffs, the scars remained. Jacob began the slow work of reclaiming his life, learning to navigate a world that had moved on without him. Sam and Ava, once just kids chasing a ghost story, now carried with them a bond forged in darkness and survival. And though the Ridgwick house would one day be boarded up and torn down, the memories it held would linger, silent reminders of what had been lost and the strength it took to find the light again. The morning after the raid, the weight in the room hadn't lifted. We had Sam back, but something in me still felt suspended, like I hadn't exhaled yet. He was quiet, worn thin by whatever he'd endured. His parents stayed close, never out of reach. Their voices soft, even when they weren't speaking. Ava sat a few feet away, her knees pulled tight, eyes fixed on the floor. No one quite knew what to say. Detective Keene stepped out to take a call, and for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the station's overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of boots on tile. Then Sam turned toward me. His voice came out dry and steady. No one believed us when we said something was down there. He wasn't wrong. I had seen it from the beginning. Even when Ava first ran into her house that night, screaming and shaking, it hadn't been enough. The responding officers treated it like a misunderstanding, kids poking around a condemned house scaring themselves. They didn't go into the basement until the second call came in. I remember standing in that living room, Ava's parents hovering nearby while she tried to explain again what she'd seen, what she hadn't had time to stop. She told the story like it was still happening. Her words clipped, eyes darting, hands clenched into her sweatshirt sleeves. But all the adults in the room kept glancing at each other with the kind of look people wear when they're already choosing not to believe. Even Sam's parents hesitated. I don't blame them not anymore. When fear and denial collide, people tend to pick the one that lets them keep their world intact. They thought maybe Sam had wandered off, gotten scared, maybe had a seizure or collapsed somewhere. They didn't want to believe that someone had reached through a hole in a wall and dragged their son out of sight. I remember Ava's father pressing her for more details. What did the man look like? What was he wearing? How tall? How fast? As if those answers would somehow make it make sense. But Ava didn't have them. All she had was a moment of pure terror, and no one was ready to sit with that. Over the next couple of days, the story started to shift. The kids at school turned it into a ghost tale, saying Sam had been cursed for going into the Ridgwick house. or that Ava had panicked and left him behind when the walls started bleeding. It all became noise. And when the police released a short statement saying they were investigating all leads people took that as confirmation that the whole thing was probably overblown. That's when the silence really set in. Ava stopped talking to most of her friends. Sam's parents avoided the grocery store, and I started hearing whispers at staff meetings, teachers speculating that maybe Ava had made the whole thing up for attention or that Sam had run away and regretted it. It didn't help that there were no official updates. The department kept things tight mostly to protect Sam's identity and preserve the investigation. But that gap between what we knew and what we were allowed to say created space for doubt. And doubt spreads fast in a small town. I still remember Ava sitting alone on the front steps of the school one afternoon, her backpack beside her and a notebook open on her lap. She wasn't writing, just staring out toward the trees across the lot where the buses disappeared one by one. I sat next to her for a while without saying anything. Finally, she asked, "Do you think they'll ever believe us?" I didn't have an answer. Because the truth is, even I had hesitated at first. When they came back from that house the first time scared out of their minds, I thought maybe they'd spooked themselves. Maybe it was a squatter. Maybe they'd imagined it. But something about the way Ava kept reliving it quietly without theatrics, something about that stuck with me. Still, when she said the words, "Someone's behind that wall," I caught myself flinching. Because if it were true, it meant we'd ignored something that had been there for who knows how long. And that kind of guilt doesn't fade easy. Detective Keene later told me the first time she walked into the Ridgewick basement, she noticed the footprints right away. Scuff marks mostly overlapping in the dust like someone had been pacing or dragging their heels. One of them matched Sam's shoe size. Another was bigger, adult, but even with that, she said there's always someone who questions the evidence. Someone who'd rather believe in mold hallucinations or pranksters than the idea that a child was taken right under our noses. And when Jacob Hale turned up emaciated, half-conscious, carrying the weight of 10 years of captivity, there were people who still asked if maybe he'd staged it. A decade, gone, and still people needed a neater explanation. Something that didn't make them question the world they lived in. When Jacob began to speak quietly at first, I saw the same look in his eyes that Ava had worn those first few days, the look of someone who'd told the truth and watched it bounce off the walls. He said he'd been held in multiple locations, always blindfolded, always alone. He said he learned to listen to the sound of footsteps, pipes, train whistles in the distance. He didn't know where he'd been moved, but he remembered the shape of certain rooms, the smell of certain walls. And he remembered hearing someone else once, a voice, a younger voice, calling out. He didn't answer at the time fear clamped down too hard, but now he wondered if it had been Sam. That part sat with me for a long time. How many others had called out before him? How many hadn't been heard? Jacob's account gave Detective Keene the momentum she needed to widen the search. She started cross-referencing old property sales buildings sold under shell companies' real estate that passed hands too frequently to be clean. She said it was like chasing smoke. Every time you thought you had something solid, it dissolved. But eventually she found patterns. Abandoned lots near highways, places with outdated water usage or sudden spikes in power, despite no one officially occupying the space. She was meticulous. But even as she pieced it together, public interest started to shift again. Some people were supportive, sharing missing person flyers and organizing neighborhood watches. But others just wanted it to be over. I overheard a man in line at the gas station say, "Those kids got themselves into trouble and now we're all paying for it." That's the thing no one wants to admit. The truth is harder to face than fiction, because fiction ends with closure. Truth just sits there uneasy and unfinished. Late one evening, I stepped outside for some air. The sky had that cold kind of quiet where every sound carries farther than it should. A breeze pushed through the trees, and I thought I heard something, maybe a screen door in the distance, maybe a car, or maybe nothing at all. But I stood there longer than usual, scanning the shadows. I thought about Sam, about Jacob, about the places we walk past every day without knowing what's behind the walls. That night, Detective Keene called me with a small update. A burner phone pinged near a site they'd flagged earlier, an old mill near the industrial line. No owner on record, no utilities listed. But something about it rang familiar. She said she was putting together a team to check it out in the morning. I didn't ask what she hoped to find. I think we both already knew. The mill sat at the edge of town, tucked between a dried-out creek bed and a thicket of woods no one had cleared in decades. The kind of place you'd pass 100 times and never look at twice. I went out there once with Detective Keene, just to walk the perimeter. It was quiet, too quiet, with rusted vents rattling in the wind and old chain-link fencing that sagged inward like it had been trying to collapse for years. She didn't go in that day, just circled the place slowly, notebook in one hand, the other tucked tight under her coat like the air itself was something to brace against. I stayed back mostly out of instinct and watched her movements from the gravel path where the access road ended. She paused once near a boarded window and crouched down, ran her gloved hand along the brick like she was listening for something. When she stood again, her expression didn't change, but I could tell. She was starting to believe it too. At home, things weren't much better. My wife kept asking if I'd heard anything new, if there was a timeline, if Sam's parents were holding up. I gave her the short version updates that didn't break confidentiality but still left a lump in my throat when I said them out loud. And Ava? She'd barely said a word in days. The night after the mill visit, I found her sitting in the living room with the TV off, just staring out the front window like she was waiting for something. I asked if she wanted to talk. She shook her head. Then, almost an afterthought, she said, "It's like the world moved on. Like none of it happened." I didn't have a good answer for that. Jacob was still recovering at the hospital, but Detective Keene checked in with him regularly. He didn't say much, never did, but every now and then something would surface. A sound, a smell, a word. Once she asked if anything about the mill photo looked familiar. He stared at it for a long time, then said, "Maybe. I remember a drain that smelled like fire." No one really knew what that meant, but it stuck. Later, one of the techs pulled the environmental reports for the surrounding area. That side of the county used to process aluminum scraps, burning down the remnants. The air out there had trace levels of chemical residue. Nothing that'd hurt you in a day, but after years, you'd know it when you breathed it in. I started carrying a notebook around, not for work, just to get things out of my head. It helped a little. I wrote down what I remembered about that night, the Ridgwick house, the footprints, the basement corridor. I tried to draw the layout from memory the way Sam had described it later. Narrow, uneven walls, insulation falling in patches, a crate turned into a makeshift seat. He'd only been in there a few hours, but he remembered every detail. Said he never felt alone, not once. Said he could hear breathing movement just past the boards. Someone else had been in there, maybe more than one. But the space had been stripped by the time the police did the full sweep. Whatever had been there, they'd taken it with them. That thought stuck with me, how careful they were. How prepared. These weren't impulsive crimes. They'd planned their exits, covered their tracks, and yet they left just enough behind for us to follow. A footprint, a breath, a rusted chain. Detective Keene started pulling old case files, unsolved missing persons break-ins, even petty thefts that never made it to court. She mapped out every abandoned structure within 20 miles of a rail line. There were more than you'd think. And slowly the spiral began. She stopped sleeping regular hours. I'd see her car outside the station at 3, sometimes 4 in the morning. Once I brought her a coffee just before sunrise. She was sitting at her desk, surrounded by maps and photos, eyes red but sharp. "It's all there," she said. but it's buried so deep they thought we'd never dig it out. People around town started whispering again. Not about Ava this time, about Jacob. About whether he'd really been missing all those years or if he'd just vanished on purpose. Someone at the diner even said maybe he'd joined a cult. That's what happens when time passes and facts feel inconvenient. People rewrite the story to fit what they can accept. But Jacob didn't care. He stayed quiet, wrote in a small spiral notebook when he couldn't sleep, kept his room cold, the blinds closed. One day I asked him if it helped writing, He looked at me for a long time, then said, "It keeps the noise still." I started noticing things I hadn't before. Old locks on buildings that shouldn't need them. Motion lights installed on sheds with no power. Burn marks near the base of utility poles like someone had tried to burn off a tag or tracking mark. I brought a few to Detective Keene's attention, and she didn't say much, just took photos and added them to her files. The more we looked, the more the pattern revealed itself, not loud or obvious, but methodical, like a rhythm under the surface. Whoever had been doing this knew how to wait, knew how to make a place look just forgotten enough. Then one night I got a call from Keene. Her voice was steady, but there was something different in the pause before she spoke. "We found something," she said. "Near the rail line east of the mill. It's not just the building. There's a tunnel. Looks hand-dug, reinforced in sections." She didn't speculate, just gave the facts. Said they were sending a team in the morning. I offered to come along, but she told me to hold off for now. The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer than it should have. Then she added, "Mark, if they were moving people through there, we need to be ready for what we find." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a while. The heater kicked on loud and dry through the vents. Ava had finally fallen asleep on the couch. Her hand dangled over the edge, her breathing steady, shoulders slack for the first time in days. I didn't wake her. Just stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet thinking about Jacob's notebook, about the shape of the corridor in the Ridgewick house, about the fire smell from the drains, about all the people who hadn't been found. Outside, a freight train passed in the distance, its horn low and distant, cutting through the night like it always had. But this time I couldn't help but wonder what was riding in the dark behind it, and who might still be waiting to be seen. The team moved in at dawn. No sirens, no radios, just boots in the grass and flashlights held low. The tunnel behind the mill wasn't on any county records. No permits, no blueprints. Nothing that should have explained why there was a hollowed-out path under 30 feet of concrete reinforced with scavenged steel beams and quiet intention. They went in slow, careful not to disturb what might be waiting inside. I wasn't there when they opened the hatch, but I saw the photos later. Old tin sheeting used as a false wall chains, rusted into the cement, and the markings. Lines drawn in ash, not paint. Counted days or people or something else no one could quite decipher. What stuck with me most was the silence. Keene said it felt like walking into a forgotten prayer, quiet, dry, and full of ghosts. They found old wrappers, torn clothing pieces of makeshift bedding pushed into corners like someone had been moved out in a hurry. It wasn't just a passageway it had been lived in, watched over, then sealed and scrubbed the moment someone knew they were being followed. One of the techs pulled a bent tin panel off the far wall, and behind it they found something that didn't belong. An access switch, fresh wiring, clean solder, the kind of installation you'd only spot if you were looking for it. It led to a narrow channel maybe 3 feet wide that sloped up behind the old pump room, and wedged in the concrete near the ceiling was a plastic bag. Inside, phone parts. A burner battery, some SIM cards, and tucked between them a flash drive. They bagged it and brought it back to the lab. The files were small, mostly corrupted or locked, but one folder opened. It was full of audio clips. Short ones, 12 seconds, 21 seconds, no longer than a minute. Some were just static, but a few had voices, faint, muffled. One of them was Sam's. You could hear him asking, "Is anyone there?" over and over with the quiet panic of someone trying not to cry. Another was a male voice, older, calm, giving instructions. Not screaming, not threatening, just firm. Like this was routine. That changed everything. Keen played one of the clearer clips for Jacob, and his hands started to shake before the voice even finished. He said that tone, the cadence, it was familiar. He never saw the man's face, but he remembered the way he gave orders. Always direct, never raised his voice. Jacob called him the Watcher, said he never slept, said he always smelled like engine oil and mint. That detail caught my attention. Mint. Not cigarettes, not sweat mint. And it stuck in my mind for days, like it meant something I couldn't quite place. Until I was walking past the back lot of the station one evening, and one of the night janitors came out for a break. He was leaning against the railing smoking a menthol, and when I passed, the scent hit me like a brick wall. Not because of the cigarette, but because it matched something I'd smelled before, years ago. There was a guy who used to volunteer with the school district, taught small engine repair. Came in once a week, always wore a pressed shirt, carried a clipboard. Said his name was Ray Leland. Never made trouble. Never raised suspicion. But one time he walked past me in the hallway, and I remember that same sharp mix, mint and grease. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. But now it was all I could think about. I dug through some old files. His name wasn't listed as a full employee, but I found a background check form cleared for volunteer work in 2013. Then nothing. No resignation, no termination, just gone. I brought it to Keen. She took it without a word and started cross-referencing known associates in the region. Ray Leland wasn't a registered offender. No warrants, no criminal history. But his name did come up in one quiet place, a property lease filed under a shell company tied to a warehouse off Route 19. A warehouse less than 6 miles from the mill. We drove out together the next day. Keen had backup stationed down the road just in case. But we didn't go in, not yet. Just watched. It was run down. Corrugated siding, part of the roof buckled inward from snow weight or neglect. But the door was padlocked with new hardware, and the parking gravel had fresh tire tracks. Someone was still using it. Not daily, but recently. Later that evening, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with an old receipt book I'd pulled from the school archives. It listed donations from local volunteers, and Ray's name showed up again once in 2014, again in 2016. Both times donating old computer equipment to the school tech program. That didn't seem odd until I looked closer at the inventory tags. None of the serial numbers matched what was logged into the system. In both cases, the computers were listed as non-functional, and both had been removed before the end of the semester. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it looked like someone had planted hardware, then taken it back after a few months. Maybe for access, maybe for storage, or maybe for something worse. Keen kept the flash drive locked in evidence, but she asked one of the techs to clone it and start analyzing metadata, timestamps, embedded locations, audio tags. One of the tags came back with a GPS marker, an old one. It pinged about 2 years ago on a road that cuts through Redwater State Park. Jacob had mentioned that name before. Not clearly, but in pieces. Said he remembered hearing trains, then silence, then the sound of water trickling over gravel. Redwater has a single rail spur that crosses a bridge before the tracks split toward the refinery district. If someone were moving people or storing equipment, that would have been the perfect place to pause. Hidden, accessible, forgotten. Keen was quiet for a long time after hearing that. She said, "They didn't just keep them locked up. They moved them, regularly, probably to keep them disoriented, probably to make them easier to break." I asked if she thought Sam had been transported like that. She said if he wasn't, he was about to be. The next day, I watched Ava get off the bus. She didn't look around like she used to, just walked straight up the driveway and into the house like the world outside wasn't worth scanning anymore. She didn't ask questions. didn't bring up the investigation. But that night she left something on the coffee table before heading to bed. A small piece of crumpled paper. Looked like part of a map. Hand-drawn. A square with lines tracing out from one side. I opened it carefully. She'd written one thing in the corner. He said the tunnel breathes. I didn't understand it at first, but it lined up with something Jacob had written in his journal. Sometimes the walls moved like lungs. We'd all assumed it was metaphor. But now, maybe not. Maybe it meant airflow, a ventilation system, maybe a connection deeper underground, something older, something we hadn't found yet. I held on to that note for a long time before showing it to Keen. When I finally did, she looked at it and said, "That's not a basement. That's a network." Then she folded it in half, slid it into her case file, and said, "We need to go back. We missed something." We went back 2 days later just after sunrise. The air was colder than it should have been for that time of year, thick with mist rolling off the creek bed behind the mill. I waited in the gravel turnout while Keen and 2 techs worked the far edge of the foundation where the old hatch had been uncovered. The tunnel system Ava had sketched what she called the breathing place wasn't on any record. But she hadn't drawn it like a child. The lines were even measured. She'd marked points where the walls exhaled or rattled, and every one of those marks lined up with vent structures beneath the slab. None of this was visible from above, not unless you knew exactly where to look. Keen crouched by one of the newer vents, running her fingers along the inside edge, then paused. She called one of the techs over, whispered something I couldn't hear, and he went back to the truck. A minute later, he came back with a bore scope camera. They fed the line into the grate maybe 20 feet in. Static for a second, then the lens settled on what looked like another chamber. Cement walls, metal shelving, something hanging coats maybe, or tarp. Then the screen glitched and the image broke apart. Whatever was under there hadn't been abandoned. They pulled back and called for a formal warrant. It'd take time too much, but they were trying to do it by the book. Keen was tense, pacing in slow, measured steps. She didn't say it out loud, but I could see it in her face. This wasn't just about the Ridgewick house anymore. It was bigger, smarter. She didn't want to spook whoever might still be moving through those tunnels. I offered to come back the next day and help sweep the area. She said no at first. Then, after a long pause, said, "Just don't go near it alone." I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't be able to stay away. That night I barely slept. I kept thinking about Ava's drawing, how precise it was, how deliberate. And that phrase again, "the tunnel breathes." I went into the garage around midnight and dug through the storage bins until I found my old flashlight and a pair of thick gloves. My wife was asleep upstairs. I left a note, just said I was driving to clear my head. I parked off the main road and cut through the tree line. No flashlight yet, just my hands on bark and rock using the moonlight where I could. When I reached the mill, I stayed low, moving along the wall until I found the panel Keen had examined earlier. It wasn't locked, just bolted with a rusted hinge. I pried it open. Inside was narrower than I expected. No stairs, just a sloped path, dirt packed down from use. I kept the light low, angling it at the ground. After maybe 20 feet, the air changed colder, damper. And then I heard it. A low hum like distant machinery, steady and mechanical. That's when I realized she was right. The tunnel did breathe. I followed the sound. Step by step, the walls narrowed, then opened into a space that was roughly square, maybe 12 by 12 feet. There were makeshift shelves built into the concrete, stacked with boxes, old jackets, tools. In the corner, a cot. Thin blanket folded. I didn't touch anything, just scanned the space slowly. On the far wall, something caught my eye, scratched into the cement. At first, I thought it was graffiti. But when I got closer, I realized it was a list. Names. Dozens of them. Some scratched deep, others faint and shallow. A few were crossed out. but one stood out near the top, Jacob. I stood there staring at it until I heard something behind me, a soft scrape like shoe rubber against concrete. I turned fast, light up, but saw nothing. Just the tunnel stretching back the way I came. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. My own breath loud in the silence. Nothing. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. I backed out slowly. No sudden movements. Once I was in the trees again, I ran. Not all the way to the car, but far enough to feel the cold burn in my chest. I waited until I could breathe again. Then I drove home. Keen didn't say anything when I told her the next morning. Just listened. Let the silence sit for a while. Then she said, "There's more than one location." I asked how she knew. She pulled out a file GPS logs from a delivery van reported stolen 6 months earlier. Same make and model as one seen outside the Ridgewick house the night Sam disappeared. Its final ping was 20 miles north near an abandoned grain silo. We went up the next day. Didn't go in, just watched. The padlock was new. The gravel was fresh. Same patterns. That night Ava spoke for the first time in days. She sat at the edge of the couch staring at her shoes and said, "There's a woman." I asked what she meant. She said, "She stands at the tunnel's edge. I've seen her." She doesn't blink. I didn't press. I just wrote it down. The next morning, Keen texted the list in the tunnel cross-checking names now. One hit already. A girl who vanished in 2011. Case closed as runaway. We may need to reopen everything. I looked out the window. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and across the street a black car I didn't recognize idled for a few seconds too long before driving away. The car showed up again the next morning, parked half a block down, engine off. Windows dark, no plates. Keen said not to approach, just document. So I took a photo from the bedroom window, time-stamped it, and sent it to her. She didn't respond right away. But that night she called and told me to come in early. She'd found something buried in the flash drive's metadata audio tagged with initials that didn't match any known victims. The file had been mislabeled as corrupted, but when decrypted it played clean. It was a recording. Not a child this time. A woman. Older. Calm voice, firm cadence. She was dictating something, names, locations, dates. Almost like inventory. But the way she spoke, there was no urgency. No guilt, just control. Near the end, her voice lowered and she said a name, Caleb. It didn't click at first. Then I realized Sam's middle name. Nobody outside the family ever used it, but she didn't hesitate, didn't pause. She knew. Keen called in a forensic linguist. They ran vocal matches, voice patterning. The closest match wasn't from a public database, it came from the Rusk Family Trust. A private voice memo left on a financial document years ago, signed by Margaret. It didn't make sense. She was Evelyn's best friend, godmother to both Evan and Maggie. She was the one who organized the first search effort when Harold went missing. But the evidence was there. Same voice profile, same rhythm. And then it got worse. An old lease surfaced a remote property under a holding company tied to a law office Margaret had used in the early 2000s. It wasn't just the same legal rep from Evelyn's will. It was the same building used to transfer ownership of the Ridgewick house, the house where Sam disappeared. Keen pulled the chain of title. It all passed through a secondary trust, signed and notarized by a man named Thorne Leland. The name made my chest go tight. I'd seen it once before, buried in Ava's school records. He was listed as an emergency contact, one the school never verified. We ran Leland through every available database. Nothing. No priors, no tax records, no voting history. But a decade earlier, he'd co-signed a lease on a property 2 miles from the mill tunnel. A month after Jacob vanished. We were dealing with more than one person, more than one house. This wasn't a singular crime, it was a network. Keen shifted strategy fast. She went federal, quietly. Brought in a retired profiler who'd worked on long-term confinement cases. He reviewed the audio, the drawings, the movement patterns. His conclusion was cold clinical. They were cycling victims through redundant properties. Psychological control, environmental disorientation. The tunnels weren't about hiding. They were about programming. That word stuck with me, programming. It made everything feel worse. Less random, more deliberate. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. She sat on the hallway floor outside my room. I didn't ask questions, just sat beside her. After a while, she whispered, "They made us name each other, but not our real names, just numbers." I asked if she remembered what Sam's number was. She nodded. 17. The next morning, Keene confirmed that the number 17 was etched into one of the cement walls at the second site near the grain silo. We'd missed it during the first sweep. That same day, one of the techs cracked a data trail buried in the flash drive's root folder. It wasn't audio or video, it was scheduling data. Movement logs, times when children were picked up or transferred. A pattern emerged every 39 days. Someone was moved, sometimes to another house, sometimes off the grid entirely. We did the math. If Sam had been held to that cycle, his transfer date would have been just days after he disappeared. Meaning, if he was still alive, he'd been gone for almost 9 months by the time we found the tunnel. And there was something else. One of the locations listed in the movement logs pinged near an old state-run juvenile rehab facility shut down years ago for code violations. When Keene dug deeper, she found photos of the interior. One room still had names carved into the bunk frame, including 17. The facility had never been listed as a crime scene, never inspected. But according to the logs, it was active again under private ownership. Keene went dark for 2 days. No calls, no texts. I knew she was building something, the kind of case you don't speak out loud until you're ready to act. Then she showed up at my house with a file. She slid it across the table. Inside were 4 names: Margaret, Evan, Maggie, and Leland. There was one more circled in red ink. Mine. I looked up, confused. She said, "That's who they reported you to. The system flagged your inquiry into the Ridgewick records months ago. That's when they started watching." I sat there silent, then asked the only thing I could. "How deep does this go?" She just said, "Farther than we thought, and someone on the inside made sure it stayed buried. I didn't ask who. I already knew." That night I checked the camera feed outside my house. The black car wasn't there anymore. But in its place, taped to my mailbox, was a single sheet of paper, a hand-drawn map. No label, just one number at the top. 17. The paper map had no labels, just a jagged line cutting through dense pine and one square marked at the edge of what looked like a dried-up creek bed. I traced it with my thumb over and over, then folded it and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. Keene told me to wait, that we'd go in together once warrants cleared, but I knew by then we didn't have time. Whoever left that map wasn't warning me they were handing something off. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe fear. I drove north before dawn, left my phone behind just in case. The roads narrowed fast after mile marker 71. No signs, no fences, just rust-colored gravel and low fog hugging the ditch line. I parked by a washed-out logging trail, then followed the creek bed by foot. It didn't take long. The square on the map was a concrete hatch half-sunken and moss-covered, bolted shut with a rusted crossbar. There was no lock. I pulled until the bar gave way and the lid groaned open just enough to slide through. The smell hit first wet rot motor oil, old rust. I dropped in feet first, flashlight low. The tunnel was narrow, carved through old drainage infrastructure. Water pooled along the edges but wasn't moving. I walked until the air changed. The room at the end wasn't like the others. No shelves, no drawings, just a thick steel door slightly ajar. I pushed it open with my shoulder. Inside was a girl, early teens, maybe sitting on a cot, her back to me. Blonde hair, cropped short sweatshirt torn at the collar. She didn't move when I stepped in. I said my name quietly. She turned slowly. Her eyes didn't focus right away. But then she whispered, 17. I nodded. I didn't know what else to say. She stood and walked toward me, then past me like she already knew the way out. I followed. We made it back to the surface just after 7. I didn't ask questions. Neither did she. I gave her my coat and called Keen from a payphone at an old bait shop 10 miles out. When she arrived, she didn't speak right away. Just walked the girl to the back seat of her car, buckled her in, and stood beside the open door for a long time. Then she came over and handed me a folded piece of paper, an arrest warrant. Name at the top, Margaret Rusk. The indictment came fast after that. Conspiracy, unlawful confinement, trafficking, destruction of evidence. Her arrest made the news, but the press didn't get the full story. Neither did the public. Too many sealed files, too many overlapping jurisdictions. But Keen made sure the tunnels were exposed. They brought in excavation teams, federal search units, even military structural analysts. 6 confirmed locations. 3 still active. Margaret pled not guilty. Her attorneys tried to block Ava's testimony. Failed. Ava sat in that courtroom with both feet on the floor and answered every question. Her voice didn't waver once. When the defense tried to discredit her memory, Keen submitted the voice recording as rebuttal. The jury didn't even flinch. Evan and Maggie were arrested 2 weeks later. Evan had moved to Utah under a new name. Maggie was found in a condo outside Tampa, hadn't used her legal ID in over a year. Both were charged with accessory crimes and financial conspiracy. Neither spoke during interrogation. Neither asked for leniency. I don't know if that was guilt or defiance. Doesn't matter now. The grain silo was demolished. Same with the facility near Ridgway Creek. Nothing salvageable. The tunnels were too unstable, too saturated. But every child's name found etched into those walls was documented. Most hadn't even been reported missing. No open files, no alerts, just names that were never asked about. Of the 23 children confirmed to have passed through the network, only 6 were found alive. Most had been moved so many times they didn't know where they were from anymore. Some had their birth records altered. A few had never been registered at all. Keen retired 2 months later. She never said why, just left her badge on the desk and walked out. Last I heard, she moved to Washington State, bought a small house near the water. Ava sent her drawings for Christmas landscapes mostly. No tunnels. I stayed in town, worked part-time with the state trauma network, helped restructure the intake protocol for recovered minors. Every now and then, someone knocks on my door, a caseworker, a parent, sometimes a survivor, and asks about Sam. We never found his body, never found a grave. But in the final sweep of the Ridgewick house under the lowest point in the tunnel system, they found a single shoe. Child size, labeled 17. No blood, no tissue, just that. Keen said it was enough for closure. Legally, maybe, but I never closed anything. I keep the map pinned to my office wall, creased and water-stained. Beside it, the names we recovered. Ava reads them out loud sometimes like a list she's memorized. Not for comfort, for record. The day Margaret was sentenced, the courtroom was silent. She looked at no one, not even her own children. When asked if she had anything to say, she paused, then smiled. 17 was my favorite. They led her out in chains. The door closed behind her like it had for so many others. Sometimes in the quiet, I still hear it. That faint hum of air behind a steel door. The scrape of something too heavy to move. The small, sharp click of a lock that never should have been there in the first place. The case is closed, names accounted for, sentences handed down. But there's no part of this that feels finished. Not really. Ava lives with a foster family, now 2 retired teachers with a house full of sunlight and bookshelves. She paints a lot. Landscapes mostly. trees with wide branches, rivers. Once she sent me a painting of a field with 17 dandelions blowing in the wind. No signature, just that number in the corner, small and steady. I keep it in my office next to the map and the recovery log. It reminds me that sometimes the smallest survivors carry the clearest truth. Evan and Maggie took plea deals. Evan got 20 years eligible for parole after 12. Maggie only got 10. She'll walk out long before she ever explains what part of her believed it was all justified. Neither one of them ever asked me why I kept digging. I think deep down they already knew. I drive out to the Rusk property once in a while, even though the house is long gone. The land's fenced off, now state-owned, overgrown, quiet. If you didn't know what happened there, you'd never guess. But I remember. The layout, the air, the silence between the walls. Every step across that field reminds me how far someone can fall while still looking you in the eye. I've talked to a few of the other survivors. Some don't remember much. Trauma does that. Others remember too much. Not just the tunnels or the rooms, but the routines, the voices, the games, and the way no one came for them until it was nearly too late. I try not to let that part settle in my bones. But sometimes it does. Margaret Rusk died in prison 6 months after sentencing. Stroke, they said. She never spoke to a therapist, never wrote a statement, never asked to see her children. She left no will, no notes, nothing but a sealed envelope marked with that same red number. It was never opened. No one claimed it. There's no memorial for the children who didn't come home. No bronze plaques, no news specials. Just a spreadsheet buried in a state database and a folder of drawings locked in evidence. But I know their names. I remember them. And I think that matters more than people realize. I've learned that justice doesn't feel like a gavel or a headline. It feels like breathing room. Like the first night someone can sleep without looking at the door. Like knowing finally that the lie you were told about your worth was never true. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for holding space for what most people turn away from. If this story stayed with you, share it. Not for me, not even for Ava, but for the ones who never made it out. So no name gets left behind.